Today we're gonna go paint a waterfall in the middle of downtown Greenville, South Carolina. It's gonna be absolutely amazing. And I'm going to talk you through the techniques that we use along the way. So here is a technique breakdown. So first off, my general philosophy on technique is two parts. The first part is that it just doesn't matter. Technique doesn't matter. If you just put the right color in the right place, then you're gonna make an absolutely amazing painting, and it doesn't matter how you do that. And I think in one way that's really freeing, and in another way that's not helpful whatsoever at all. So the second part is gather as many techniques as you humanly possibly can, because each technique is a tool to put in your tool belt. And the hazard comes at deciding that a technique is the only way to do something, or that you need to force that technique to try and do something that it's really not helpful for, right? We're just looking for what can help me do the one thing that I'm trying to do right now the best, and whatever technique helps to do that, to put the right color in the right place, is what we should be using. So that's my general philosophy. So as we're getting into this painting, essentially I'm using as many techniques as I humanly possibly can, but it's really tapping into my intuition to say right now what is going to be the most helpful. And unfortunately there just is no right or wrong. There's just helpful and not helpful. There's only cause and effect. So let's have a look. To start with, I made the mistake of getting a paper that's a little bit too light for what I'm doing. Generally, if I'm painting this big, I'll use a 600 GSM paper. That's like a cardboard, essentially. And the one that I'm using right now is, I think it's 300 GSM, and it's taped to foam core. And I've wet the front, I wet the back, and now because it's thin enough, if the paper is smaller at 300 GSM, then it's great. Like it's not necessarily gonna buckle, but you make it huge and it's gonna buckle really quickly. So I've made the mistake of using this 300 GSM at 20 inches by 30 inches, and now it's buckling all over the place. But you'll see as the painting moves on, it's going to become less and less buckled as it dries. And so I'm not so worried about the buckling at this point. This does change things though. Normally when I'm maybe painting a waterfall like this, I'll be relying on trying to get all of that wet in wet, just stuff going in the water at the beginning, because that's when we have the opportunity to really get sort of the soft edges of everything without having to come back in again. And so right now I'm doing the opposite, because if I start to paint lots of wet and wet into all of the buckled area, we're gonna get a lot of pooling water. It's gonna go in ways that I don't want it to. And so it does affect the way that I'm doing this. But again, we just sort of tap into intuition for a second, say, you know what, this is what I wanna do, but now it's not gonna work. So let's try something else. But I am gonna come in and just get my major shapes, even if I'm not gonna put a whole bunch of water into them. And so right now, this is kind of like watercolor. And I'm using these really massive brushes that I just got. While this is wet, I'm coming in with some pretty quickly with some thicker paint in here. What I wanna do is really establish my lights and my darks and my colors so that I have something to go off. While I'm not doing that with the entirety of the waterfall, I'll at least do it at the top where I get a little bit more color. Now you can see the light is changing, just constantly changing. I have these giant clouds. This is my least favorite conditions to paint in, but we're going for it. But the whole idea right now is I'm gonna use these big brushes with almost kind of like a watercolor painting technique, which just means lots of water, lots of paint, and try to get really big shapes with really big brushes. You can see that leaves just giant spaces of color rather than anything else. This could be lots of brush strokes, but I'm gonna leave those lots of brush strokes until later and really just try to get in these major shapes. I'm also at this point, we're leaning up against the edge of this waterfall. I don't want really strong edges up against the waterfall. So I'm gonna use some water and soften those edges that are right there. Now, when we're painting this big, I really want to just establish shapes. And that's what we're doing, right? We're not getting into detail. But sometimes those shapes require refinement. We want the simple shapes, but we want them to be specific enough. And so we're just getting in the big shapes and the places where we can see the light versus the shadow, and just getting these in. Because, you know, any 1 square inch of this painting could take as long as I took for this painting to make. And so if we just come in with the really big things first, we can really lean into trying to create the totality of the piece before anything else. So big shapes of big color. We do want them accurate. We want the shapes accurate, we want the colors accurate. But if we can do that, big shapes of big color, then we can see what's really pulling our attention around and lean into those things. But let's talk about technique. Even with a small brush, you can make a large space of paint without having all of the brushwork everywhere. And this is using something called the bead method right here. Painting down, letting gravity pull that paint down. And if we do it quick enough, if we can get enough paint on with enough water quickly before the edges dry, then I can get that whole space to have either one consistent color, or I can change the color throughout it without it looking and feeling like there's a whole bunch of brush marks. Now, sometimes we want brush marks and sometimes we don't, so we just change our technique accordingly. Here, where there was a whole bunch of trees or a vine that I was painting, I wanted the brush strokes. And so I really aggressively attack it with a little bit more paint, a little less water, and we'll see that. Now I'm ready to dive into this waterfall a little bit more, and I'm going to lay down a whole bunch of water with a little tint of color. And the reason I'm doing this is you can see just above my arm where there's a whole bunch of places you can see through the waterfall. I want these, but I don't want them to be really hard because they don't feel hard when I'm looking at them. And so I put the water down and then I paint into the water, and then I get this really big brush, the one that I've been using, and smooth it out. It's not about sort of rendering or getting things smooth. It's more about having something with really soft edges. And if you've painted in gouache before, you know soft edges aren't necessarily easy. And so you could see even under my palette, I have 1, 2 extra brushes. I have 3 brushes that I'm using consistently here. And you know, some of it's this big one for smoothing, a smaller one for one color, another brush for another color even still. We want to come in and play with water to try and change our edge quality. Again, here I'm going to pull in a whole bunch of color, some really nice color, and then soften the edges as I go. Because the closer we are to this moving water, the more we want to be careful about really getting these soft edges in. It's kind of about, what am I communicating about? If I am sitting here communicating about a rock, then a really hard edge is exactly what I want. And so painting directly, getting really in there, and getting big brush strokes just to come out, that might be exactly what I want. But if I'm painting this big rush of water, it's constantly moving. There's a sense of movement within that I can intentionally, if I'm focusing on one little thing moving, really get my eyes to focus and pull out something with a really hard edge. But that's not really my experience of it. My experience of it is big movement. And we can either soften things with a brush using the water, we can soften things with a brush without water, and it just sort of changes the textural quality of the edge. Or I can use hard edges that gradually change their values, go from light to dark or dark to light. And if I do it gradually, it'll feel softer. It's 100% about, what do my eyes see and how does that feel to me as the person who's painting? And then how can I find a technique that's going to feel good and feel appropriate while I'm doing that? So as we come in here, and I'm really sort of regathering some of the values that I've put down. Some part of it's because it's dried, some part of it because we're at a later point in time, and so the light changes. And the question then is, what's going to serve this painting best? And I think having these shapes be a little bit darker, like I'm currently seeing them, is going to be helpful, because that's going to give more contrast to the waterfall. And so I'm going to go back in, and because I had painted them thin before, they're going to be pretty easy to paint on top of right now. And so again, we take this painting, we've got the big shapes, come in with more refined shapes. And as I'm doing this, I'm getting thicker and thicker. And we're at this stage where we're kind of working in, trying to get more of the texture rather than the shapes. And so I'm going to use a little bit more dry brush, a lot thicker paint, to try and get a sense of what's happening here. When we have these big shapes that were already sort of defined here, we can divide them up by putting in the smaller things. And I kind of like to do it like this, where I've put in the big shapes and then I'm pulling in the smaller shapes, because it's starting with something that's really cohesive and then dividing from there. But if you start with something that's already divided, it tends to, at least to me, be a lot more difficult to make it feel cohesive. I'm also dealing with what's over here with the water, and I'm treating it a lot more like watercolor. And the reason I'm doing that is, again, I had talked before about how we can either use water to soften things, or I can go for gradual movements in value in how light and dark things are to get more of that soft look. And so I'm using that idea for the one that's a little bit further away, because in one way, we're a little bit later in the stage, but secondly, it fits with what I'm seeing a lot better, just as the technique, because I'm seeing more of those individual striations all the time rather than the giant gushing of water. But as we're talking about that giant gushing of water, I'm coming in, I want something more defined. Sometimes just having these big washes of water doesn't really feel as satisfying enough. I've tried to cultivate the sense of what are my eyes grabbing onto? And they generally need to grab onto something. And sometimes this means that I have to soften things so they're grabbing onto the right thing. Or, such as this, I have a really big sense of that water moving, but my eyes almost want to go elsewhere because there's just not quite enough happening. It's like having a hook in a song. It doesn't mean that the rest of the song's not important, but your attention just needs that little hook to grab a hold on. So getting these sort of very hard-edged or very articulated brushstrokes in gives you something more to grab a hold of, and then lets that, if the analogy to continue, the rest of the song to really pull it together. But you need that hook and you need the song. By the way, if you're interested in learning about techniques and learning about gouache and how to use it, how to use the entirety of gouache in as much as you can, then I have an 8-week online class that I'd love to invite you to. I also have a free workshop called The Roadmap to Learning Gouache, where I'm going to tell you how I would learn gouache, how I'd go about that from the very beginning if I had to start all over again. So hopefully you guys can save years of time that I had to put into and I wasted on things that just aren't all that important. So they're both in the description below. I'd love to invite you to both of them. See you there, but let's keep painting. As the light's moving on, I'm seeing a lot more of these purples in here. These really cool colors. And so I'm using this to help, again, get the texture in and really pull these cooler colors in. So much dry brushing right now because I have the values down, I have some of the colors, but there's a sense that this rock is wet and you can see some of the dry parts, you can see some of the wet parts and the texture. And so we want to get a lot of that in. And we can do that by letting the underlayer really pull through. Ooh, now we're getting into these trees right here. And there's this idea when you're using a round brush that you can actually grab your brush. Let me see what I got. Let's say that I have this brush here. And that if I'm really pushing down and doing this, I can make a small gradient where this pod next to the ferrule, if I'm putting pressure on it, isn't imparting quite as much paint. but the part up here that has less pressure on it is pushing that paint out. And so you get this little gradient. And so if I can do that, I can create hard edges and soft edges in a single brush stroke. Really helpful. And again, we're coming in now just with more texture, something more to hold on to. Out of a painting where we're looking for parts of the painting that feel like they're maybe missing out a little bit, feel like I haven't quite put enough there, my eyes are slipping away where I don't want them to, or being brought to that place when I don't want them to. And so I'm sort of rebalancing, readjusting, just looking for little things. Now is a spot that I could get more into detail. So for example, right here, just putting these down. And I like to use these squirrel brushes or calligraphy brushes because they can get to a really fine point, and at the same time, you can do really big movements with them or splay the edges out and get texture like this. And I can use one brush to do most of the painting, lots of big, wide range of techniques. So my invitation to you is twofold. One, you don't need to learn techniques. You just don't. You just need to learn to put the right color in the right place, right? I'm being a little facetious, but it's kind of true. And then second, you should learn all of the techniques because everything helps you. Nothing, and they're all here to serve you, right? You're not here to serve a technique. If you want to abandon it, go ahead and abandon it. But learn as many techniques, as much of gouache as you can, because the more you know and the more of the full breadth of gouache that you can use, the more free you are to express yourself, the more free you are to just see something and know how you want to paint it without kind of having to struggle with it. And a lot of the times we're going to do this by sitting down, looking at what you're looking at, and try to think about what would that look like as a painting? What are the effects that would look like? Does that look like it's wet and wet? Does that look like it's wet to dry? Is that a soft edge or a hard edge? Is that textural? Is it really textural? Or does it feel like a couple of different colors playing together? And so to try and look at your subject and think about what kind of paint effects it already looks like helps you to turn around then and to decide what paint effects you want to use to make it look like that. Or else, just put the right color in the right place. But have fun. I'll see you guys next week.